Welcome to another episode of Grace Under Pressure, where my special guest today is Gareth Tennant. I'll tell you about Gareth in a moment. Those of you who know the show know that the show focuses on grace as it relates to caring, compassion, and generosity. And when you're as a leader, you need to act for the benefit of others as well as energize the organization. And so welcome, Gareth. It is a treat to have you, especially at our very special time. You are joining us from the UK. So
yeah, thank you very much for having me. And thank you especially for allowing a impetuous colonialist to join you on this quite important day in Michigan.
I'll tell the folks all about you. You're the former head of operational intelligence for the Royal Marines, and you're still a reserve, but now you are specialized in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations. You are applying that trade to the corporate world. And you had a very interesting example, which I saw was written up in The Economist, and that's why I reached out to you, an experience in Somalia, which I will talk about. And again, now you support business leaders, governments, and security services in the art of decision making. And boy, do we need informed decision making now. And we had talked before, Gareth, about their stress testing ideas and challenging assumptions, which is very important, especially now in our time of crisis. We've got our pandemic, a virus, economic fragility, social, racial injustice in the U.S., and everything's turned upside down. So anyway, I like your approach because you're dealing with research and intelligence, and you have the guts and gumption behind it. So this will be an exciting talk. And so welcome, Gareth.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great. Gareth, I'm going to jump right in, and I almost lead every show the same way, but we're under a lot of pressure today. So what are you hearing from your clients? What are your clients telling you?
Yeah, so I think, firstly, at a very broad level, we're at an inflection point in history. There are probably a collaboration of three things that are happening. One is we're becoming very aware of the effect that we're having on the planet and the stresses that us as a species are having. There's also I think at a social level, an ever-growing sense of dislocation as a result of the faster pace of technological change and the exponential growth in access to information. And I think, thirdly, the change from having to fight for information to now having to fight to establish the veracity of information. And I think those two things are creating a lot of discomfort personally and socially, but also in the decision-making routines of commercial organizations.
That's a very valid point. And, there's lots of information out there, but how valid is it? And so that's why we need wise minds with experience to guide us. So you are a Royal Marine on reserve, but you had an experience with Somali pirates off the coast of Yemen. Tell us about it and how it applies to what you do now.
Yeah, so first it's just an interesting story, I think, and then secondly, it kind of was one of the pivotal moments where I realised something quite important. So it was back in 2010, and I was the officer commanding a Royal Marines boarding team, which is similar to the US Marine Corps BBSS teams. So we interdict, disarm, and then detain pirates, terrorists, criminals at sea. And we've done exactly that with a group of Somalis that were suspected pirates. I mean, they were pirates. We found 13 of them with RPGs and AK-47s, etc., and boarding ladders and all the rest of it. But because of the United Nations laws of the sea, we were in a position where we couldn't arrest them because we didn't have direct proof. There's no law about being armed at sea. You're allowed to be. So all we could do was disarm them and then remove all of the equipment they had for committing piracy and then make sure they got safely back to Somalia. And we were in the process of doing that, and there was some confusion. And I think because of the language barrier and the cultural barriers and all the rest of it, they panicked. They thought we were going to abandon them at sea. And so a few of them jumped in the water and the rest of them attacked us. And at this point, we've got a helicopter with a sniper overhead, and we've got a couple of sea boats with machine guns, and then a few of us are on their skiffs. There's 3 of us on their skiffs, and there's 13 of them. And so we end up in this sort of odd hand-to-hand combat situation.
3 against 13.
Yeah, well, I think 3 or 4 of them had jumped in the water. Yeah, absolutely. We were still armed, but they were unarmed. But at that point, there's very little you can do. We weren't going to go lethal with our weapons, so we were sort of grappling with these guys. And because of that, I wasn't really in a position to give any orders or communicate really with my team. But what was interesting was we went from complete calm, having control of the situation, to complete chaos, and then back to regaining complete control in about 30 or 40 seconds. And the guy standing behind me, one of my Marines, fired a warning shot into the water. The snipers repositioned themselves in the helicopter as they saw the sea boats moving off. The sea boats with the machine guns were now pretty useless at providing covering fire because we're sort of in and amongst each other. So one of the boats came in to provide intimate support. One of the boats went to pick up the now casualties in the water. The pirates can't swim, who knew?
Yeah.
And the warning shot did the job, and it shocked most of them. And then the 2 or 3 guys that were at the front that a few of us were grappling with, we applied violent force, but controlled force, and limited. So it was restraining force to push them back into their boat to regain control of the situation. And all of that happened in about 30 seconds. And what's interesting to me is the pirates acted out of fear, stress, fatigue, and most of all groupthink. You know, one person snapped and they all went. My team acted out of a controlled response, which was due to the fact that we were a team that worked very closely together and had done for a long time. We came from an organisation that had shared values and shared standard operating procedures, but also we'd rehearsed what we were going to do to the nth degree. So we had a lot of muscle memory in the way that we used our equipment and the way that we did things. And then finally, we'd also red teamed the plan. We talked through how things might change, what scenarios we might find ourselves in the various boardings, from having to go lethal and having casualties, all the way through to picking people up out of the water, people resisting arrest, and all of these different scenarios. And we talked through what we would do. So although we hadn't talked through this exact scenario, we had a good idea of how to adapt a plan that we'd already talked through and practiced. And so it was far easier for us to respond to the situation we found ourselves in. So I like to think of it as the pirates reacting and my team responding to the situation.
There's one note before we go further, and I love how you integrated the red team in there. Explain what that is to us civilians.
Yeah, so red teaming it comes originally from the military, but is being adopted now by the commercial world more and more. And it's simply a way of exploring plans and identified situations from the perspectives of other actors. So when you develop a plan, you tend to think about it in terms of what you're going to do, what your organization's going to do. And what a red team does is they will think about and then talk about what they would do in response, how they would react to the situation, what decisions they would make. And what it allows, therefore, is critical discussion and about the interplay between actors in an environment. So it comes from the military, where we would get the intelligence team to be playing the enemy in a war game. So literally on a map with models, and they would play out how we think the enemy's going to respond, trying to take into account and trying to be empathetic to the way that they think about things, the way that their culture will affect their decision making, the access to information they will have. And you can apply it to the commercial world just as well. And you can start to think about what your competitors might do, what your suppliers might do, what your potential customers might do. And it allows for slightly more divergent thinking around your plans, and it finds perhaps areas, gaps or holes in your plans, or areas that need further development.
That's a great thing. I liked your concept of divergent thinking, and it's the element of surprise. What happened to you on that boat? You said a couple of times 30, 40 seconds. In the corporate world, it's 30, 40 days is a short period of time, but but I think what's element is that preparation, that you didn't have the exact scenario, but you were prepared to act. And I think that's what you teach right now. Am I correct, Gareth?
Yeah, absolutely. And we were talking before we came live on air about organizations that are dealing well with this pandemic. This is a crisis. It's the corporate equivalent of the pirate attack. And the organizations that are doing well have thought in advance, not about this type of pandemic, but about situations where the market becomes unstable, about providing resilience to their supply chains, and all of the potential scenarios. And if you build a bit of resilience into your organization, you find that when a crisis arises, you're in a far better position to respond to it.
And I think, what you well know this, that we are in anxious times, uncertainty. And what employees or followers are looking to their leaders for is for clarity. And obviously, you can do the best you can do. Do you think the concept of the red teaming or the stress testing is a way of gaining clarity?
Yeah, absolutely. But you've got to caveat it. What it isn't doing is, and it comes back to this divergent, convergent thinking, it's not predicting the future. So what we're not going to do is have clarity about what's coming next. What we will do is have clarity how we will respond to a range of future scenarios, allowing and empowering people to then adapt those response plans as they find themselves confronted with the reality.
That's such an important point, and thanks for clarifying that. And I think what I was trying to say is that this act of preparation gives you a sense of resilience in a way. So we don't know what the future will bring, but we're prepared for multiple outcomes, and we will have a response. Is that correct? So
that's exactly it. And it comes with two things. It comes with giving teams the space and the resources to think about these things. Because if we think about it from a commercial perspective, it takes resources, time, and effort to think about possible futures that may never happen. Which, if your time and resources are about making money, it's quite difficult to allow yourself to do that. So it takes a little bit of leadership and senior command of organizations to allow this to happen. And then secondly, it comes to a point where you need to empower your subordinate people within the organization. So centralized decision making doesn't work if you're trying to be adaptive.
Okay.
You need to not only test these future scenarios, but you need to then talk about how you're going to empower people to make the decisions when they are faced with whatever situation they might be faced with. So we train people, we build trust, and that mutual trust goes, it's trust in your employees to make the right decision, and it's trust from the employees that they will be protected when they make decisions.
Of reciprocity.
Absolutely, yeah.
You have a theory of leadership, which is dear to my heart. You call it about sphere leadership.
Yeah.
I'm a member of Marshall Goldsmith 100, and one of our members and inspirations is Frances Hesselbein. And Frances was president of the Girl Scouts, and she had a concept. She called it circular management. She, as the head, put herself at center. So tell me your theory of spherical leadership.
These are an amalgamation of lots of ideas. This isn't my original thought, but absolutely, we if we think about organizations in the 20th century where the scenarios and the environments that they were operating in didn't change that quickly, then it was all about efficiency. Competitive advantage was about making things and providing services faster, better, and cheaper than your competitors. In the world where the environment changes, where the technology and the social change happens quicker than you can guide your oil tanker of an organization, then the big structures, centralized organizations, struggle to be agile and adaptive. And so we need to start thinking about organizations as, I think General Stan McChrystal says it best, teams of teams. And we need to empower decision-making further out towards the edge of that circle or that sphere. So rather than thinking of a pyramid with the CEO at the top and the C-suite, and they set the strategy and make all the decisions, and then the worker bees go and do, we need to think about leaders all the way across the organization, but with a very central core, which is the strategy, which is held together with what it is you're trying to achieve as an organization, where you're trying to get to, the values that are important to that organization. And they can't change, because if they change, you end up with anarchy, because you have agile decision making without a structure to hold it together. But as you go further out towards the edges of this sphere or circle, the edges are what are interacting with the rest of the environment, with people, customers, dealing with complaints, dealing with suppliers, whatever it is. They're interacting. They understand the environmental changes as they're happening. They need to be empowered to make the right decisions, or to make decisions. And also, and I think this is an important point, if they make the wrong decision, as long as they do it for the right reasons, they need to be rewarded, even if it loses the company a customer or money, or because it's a learning opportunity and it's a way of failing forward. And it all comes back to the military world from a thing that we call mission command, which is the idea of in the chaos of conflict, you can't control everything. So a commander has to set the effect that they want to achieve, the intent, what it is they want to end up having done at the end of the engagement, at the end of the battle, but then allow subordinate teams and subordinate commanders to make decisions about how they're going to do that. And there needs to be clear constraints on that, but we need to empower, train, and trust our people to go and do in order to achieve the why that we've set.
Well told. There's another thing, and I think you have something, a point of view. Many businesses love analytics. We all do, of course, management. Predictive analytics. What's the drawback to predictive analytics? So.
Yeah. So
don't worry, you can blow up your career right here.
Well, I mean, there is a lot of value in predictive analytics, of course, but it's just a tool. It's another way of using algorithms and maths to make sense of data. And we've got to think about the difference between data, information, and intelligence. And data is raw, unprocessed, ubiquitous, and therefore useless. We aggregate it and process it, we turn it into information, it has potential value. When we use that information to make decisions or to persuade other people to make decisions, we are realizing that value. But in a complex environment where you can't predict the future because it's complex, there are so many factors, there are so many other players and actors that you can't predict, then you need a test and adjust approach, and you need to be divergent in your thinking and creative, albeit it has to end with some decisions that need to be made. And we can't become slaves to the model. So predictive analytics has a role, it has a place, but if we become beholden to it and we think it's the oracle, when it's wrong, we're all wrong. So it has to be situated.
Part of that is you have a theory, or we had talked this about companies that succeeded are doing fine in our time of economic crisis and pandemic. What is your theory on that, Gareth?
Yeah, so well, first we've got to discount luck, because luck always plays a part, and it's very easy to use survivor bias. for people that have just been lucky. But there is definitely a trend of the organizations that are not only surviving, but are starting to thrive. And let's be honest with each other, it's too early to tell quite where this is going. But the ones that look like they're starting to thrive are ones that have thought about the disruption that is coming. Maybe not necessarily from this pandemic, but from a range of things that we've already mentioned today that are creating this disruptive and VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment, and therefore started to prepare for it. They built resilience into their organizations. So they did all the things we've talked about in terms of empowering decision making further out towards the edge of the organization, of building diverse teams that can think critically, that can think, overcome the biases, and explore new paradigms, but also did like practical things like kept a reserve. So there's quite a few companies in South Asia and China where there were activist hedge funds and other shareholders pushing for share buybacks and dividends, and there was resistance because 18 months ago in South Korea, in China, they saw a potential trade war coming. They saw the disruption of the balance shift between the East and the West, and so they kept cash reserves. And now, at a time where there is huge disruption to their supply chains, to their employment, they are using those cash reserves to not only stay afloat, but to seize the opportunities for adaptation. So my theory is basically you need to build the change that is happening around you into your culture. So, and it's a cliche to say change is the new normal, but effectively you need to build adaptability and agility into your organizations through empowerment and through divergent and creative thinking.
Gareth, one of the themes of this show we talk about is resilience. What you have just described is, change is the new normal, and the adaptive processes that you've described. Would you call that a form of organizational resilience? So,
absolutely, yeah, definitely, and it directly ties to personal resilience as well.
Yes,
because if change is the culture of your organization, then you can start to build people's emotional resilience to change. And this is something where lessons directly are pulled from the military into the commercial world, because chaos and complexity is the operating environment of the soldier or the sailor or the airman. And we have high-performing teams that accept that they don't know what they're going into in any kind of detail. They don't know what the end result's going to be. They accept, great physical risk at times, and yet they are very strong cooperative teams, high-performing teams. And it's because the organizational resilience bleeds into a culture that creates psychological safety and personal resilience.
I'm glad you tied that into the human element. And I know that one of my previous guests on the show was Alden Mills, who's former Special Forces, and like you, is in the corporate world. And he talks about the unit cohesion. But the way you've described it is, in a way, I'll just riff on it. Resilience breeds resilience. If you're my commanding officer and I see you acting this way, then I'm going to respond that way, and I'm going to be that way with my peers. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, definitely. And but there's a fine line between building that kind of resilience and then building a false confidence, if you like, or an arrogance, where no matter what happens, we're going to win, isn't the same as no matter what happens, we as a team are going to make the right decisions and get through it.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because you're too much. I don't want to say this, but too much confidence is hubris.
Absolutely, yeah.
So part of resilience then, if we expand it, might be the ability to walk away from a situation. I don't mean quit, but say, it's not our time, it's not our day.
Definitely. And I think humbleness, which is the opposite of hubris, is a key attribute of leadership.
Right.
Being humble enough to accept that you don't have all the answers all the time, and you can turn to your team and get those answers is really important. Humbleness enough to accept that you made a call and it was wrong, and not to throw good money after bad and double down on it because you don't want to be exposed. And humbleness to try things and accept that you're going to make mistakes is how, not only as individuals, but as teams, we learn.
No, I'm glad you linked that into humility. That's a theme, of course, in grace, of course. And it's so good to hear you talk about it, because our perception from civilians who don't know a lot about military is that you guys are strong men and women and tough and all this, and you persevere. But there is an element of humility, is there not? So
I think that absolutely has to be. And there is definitely a juxtaposition of physical courage and physical strength and determination and tenacity to get through the hardship, the physical and emotional hardship of conflict. But that has to be paired with the ability to learn from a constantly changing environment and to learn from the team around you.
That's great. It's got to be a constant learning process and a two-way learning process, if I'm not mistaken. So, and I'm glad the way that we're morphing into resilience and how it, becomes our fallback. And there's a theory about resilience, and one of our colleagues here, Eileen McDarg, talks about resilience is that ability to bounce forward, and you're working into a changed environment. So it's not just not bending, not breaking, but you're coming, perhaps it's a transformational process. So.
Yeah, I think so. I think, there's a difference between survival and resilience, which is, if we think about the definition of the word, it's about absorbing the change and then responding to it in an appropriate way. If you get hit by a change and it doesn't quite knock you over, that's not resilience. That's just having enough resource to survive a punch. Yeah. If you learn from it, if you move forward, if you the next time takes the same punch, are better prepared for it, you are building resilience.
That's great.
You can keep getting punched and keep moving forward.
Great. Wonderful. We're coming to the end of this fascinating discussion. I could go on for a lot longer. I invite all of our guests to share a story of grace, either in their own lives or they observe. Do you have such a story, Gareth?
I do, yeah. So I was thinking about this on my dog walk earlier, and I was thinking there are lots of instances of grace, because I'm very fortunate to be surrounded by lots of loving and wonderful people in my life. But I was thinking about the name of the show, Grace Under Pressure, and thinking of times where I've experienced that, and there's one that stood out to me, and it's a very tragic event. So back in 2008, I was serving with a close combat company in Afghanistan, in Helmand province, and my company was unfortunately attacked by a suicide bomber who was a 13-year-old boy, pressed into action by the Taliban. And he killed 3 members of our company. And I was a very new troop commander. This was my first operational tour. And I got back to the forward operating base that we were working from. And it was told by my company commander we were going back out on the ground. We were the troop that was going to go back out to show the enemy that we weren't going to, succumb to their attacks, and that we would still to provide security on the ground to the locals and carry on with our mission. And up until that point, I'd been sort of dealing with the situation and trying to stay in control. And my boss telling me that I have to go back out onto the ground. I've got to tell the blokes we're going back out onto the ground. I felt myself really starting to get to my emotional limits. And physical limits as well. It was tiring and stressful work. And And whilst I was sort of thinking about what I needed to do in terms of reanalyzing the situation, rewriting the orders, getting the team together, one of my young Marines tapped me on the shoulder and handed me a cup of tea and said, "Boss, I think you need a cup of tea." And in the situation we were in at the time, making a cup of tea was actually quite an effort. It meant getting out a burner. It meant going to get water from the jerry cans, and it wasn't just put the kettle on.
Yeah.
And he'd gone to the effort of doing this and coming to me and saying, "Boss, I think you need a cup of tea." And this was a young 18-year-old who'd only been in the troop for a couple of months before we deployed to Afghanistan. Really young lad. And he said to me in an almost authoritative tone, "I think you need a cup of tea." And put his hand on my shoulder. And it was that moment that I suddenly, well, one of many moments, but one of the moments I realized that leadership doesn't come from rank. It doesn't come from being the person in control or with the authority. Leadership comes from everybody all the time to deal with the circumstances they find themselves in. And he'd clearly seen me and in the state I was in and said, "That man needs a cup of tea." And it was just such a graceful act that it gave me that emotional resolve to pick myself up and carry on. And also to realize that, I don't have to have all the answers all the time, and I don't always have to be in control. I just have to manage this wonderful team of great people that I had.
What a powerful story, Gareth. Thank you. And so very English in the sense, but in your culture, that cup of tea and how that young man had the gumption to come up to you, his commanding officer, and say, "Here, boss, take a load off." So that's great. What a wonderful story, Gareth. You've been a terrific guest. I'm kind of sorry we have to end this conversation, but how can people find you?
Yeah, great. So I run a company called Decision Advantage, and the best way to find me is on LinkedIn, Gareth Tennant, MSc, and also through an organization called the Future Strategy Club, who I partner with some other brilliant and much brighter people than me, to help form brilliant high-performing teams that solve problems. So www.futurestrategyclub.co.uk, or reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I would love to start a conversation with you.
Gareth, you've been a great guest, and thank you. And we're going to close it out right now. So,
John, thank you very much for having me.